Last week we read Ruth chapter 1 together. This week we'll read Ruth chapter 2. I'm going to restrict my comments to just 2 before we begin. You should have one handout that has a lot of stuff on it from Matt and one that has a lot less on it from me. The one with less on it from me that begins with introductory comments has a couple bits that I'd like to read before we begin reading Ruth. As I argued last week in Ruth chapter 1, each of the 3 main figures in the book of Ruth resembles a distinct type. Boaz is painted as the righteous man who embodies and fulfills Torah. Naomi is not just Naomi, but she stands for embittered old Israel, who has known God for a long time, but has also seen the world and fallen into despair. Ruth is a Gentile who embodies not Torah's laws, but the heroic virtues, like friendship, courage, and strength. There's a difference between heroism and righteousness, and attending to the differences between Ruth and Boaz bears that out. I bring that up again to point out that in chapter 2, what Boaz embodies and fulfills in particular are the gleaning laws. Those 2 laws, or those laws, are given for you on the sheet here. I'm going to read to you from Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24. These are the laws of gleaning. Ruth chapter 2 is, among other things, a living commentary on these laws. Listen to this from Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am Yahweh your God. Notice first that the exact gleaning line isn't specified. It's just not to the very edges. How much of that, not codified here. Look again at Deuteronomy 24, beginning in verse 19. In a similar way, the law says, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. I'll go ahead and begin the story. To leave it as much time on the clock for Matt as possible, I'm going to just point out some underlined bits. Ruth 2, beginnings on this front page, continues onto the back. It begins this way. Now to Naomi there was a man known to her husband. He was a mighty man of clout from the clan of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Now Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, permit me to go and permit me to glean among the sheaves after one in whose eyes I find favor. And Naomi says, echoing her first word in chapter 1, go, my daughter. And Ruth went and she came and she gleaned in the field after the reapers. She happened to happen upon a portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to his reapers, the Lord be with you. And they said to him, and also with you, may the Lord bless you. That was a joke. And Boaz said to his young man, the one stationed over the reapers, to whom is this young woman? And the young man, the one stationed over the reapers, answered, and he said, well, the young woman, she's a Moabitess who returned with Naomi from the fields of Moab. She came up to me and said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she came, and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting for even a moment. Boaz begins a conversation with Ruth. It goes well, and at the end of the conversation, down to where the next underlines are on the back of your page, it says, when she got up to glean again, Boaz instructed his young men, let her glean, even among the standing sheaves, not just the ones that have fallen, and do not reproach her. You must also go and pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to clean, and do not rebuke her. The picture of this that I have is, when you're walking from the basement where the laundry unit is with an armful of clean laundry and then socks are falling as you go. Those are the gleanings. What he's saying is effectively take some fistfuls of laundry and just pull it out so there's more for her to pick up. He's going what appears to be above and beyond. So she gleaned in the field all the way until evening. Next underlined, her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. She asks, "Where did you glean today?" In response to the review of the story, Naomi says, "Blessed be this man by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." At the very end of the chapter, it says that she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Let me summarize chapter 2 this way. Ruth is in need of work, money, food, and she happens to happen upon an old distant relative's land, and he goes out of his way to make sure there's enough for her to pick up. And she's there all day and for a whole harvest season. To comment on this, Matt Messer.
Thank you very much, Jack. So for today, hopefully everyone has a handout. Jack very helpfully gave us an introduction to Ruth 2. He invited me to speak today, and it's going to be a little bit looser. I know in the past we've done some sort of like close reading exegesis. I want to kind of use Ruth 2 as a jumping off point to consider, inspired by the example of Boaz and how he has mercy on Ruth and has compassion on her and gives of his own goods to her, to reflect on the sort of Christian tradition, the historical Christian understanding of what is the purpose of the material goods that we have and what is our obligation to the poor. So I'm going to circle it back around to Ruth 2 in particular, but I think this is kind of raised by the actions of Boaz in the text, and to consider, how do we understand what he's doing here? How does the Christian tradition understand what someone's responsibility is in a position like his? So to begin, this is coming from a very different angle, from the opposite angle actually, but I think it'll help us jog our thinking. Rather than kind of starting what's the responsibility of the rich man, to think about the position of the person who is poor or who is in need. So I wanted to just kind of get us thinking about the issue. I've included here just a little consideration. It's sort of a classic philosophical question about, is it okay to steal bread, if you're hungry, or if to feed your family? How is that understood ethically and morally? Seems like you're doing something bad, but for a good reason, for some kind of need. And so I wanted to see what a great theologian has to say about this particular case. And his answer, I think, is very informative. It reveals a certain understanding of the things that we receive, what they're for, what they come from, and how we ought to understand them and act accordingly. So Thomas Aquinas asks in his Summa Theologiae, his summary of theology, whether it is lawful to steal in a case of necessity. Okay, and I'm going to read this. I'll just give you a heads up. During our session today, I'm going to be doing a lot of reading because I just kind of want us to soak up some of these thoughts, and then by the end we should have some time that I want to open up to questions and get your perspectives as well. But I think it'll be a fun exercise just to read a lot together. Okay. So in answer to this question, Thomas Aquinas says, I answer that things which are of human right cannot derogate from natural right or divine right. Now, according to the natural order established by divine providence, by God, inferior things are ordained for the purpose of succoring man's needs by their means. Wherefore, the division and appropriation of things which are based on human law do not preclude the fact that man's needs have to be remedied, and by means of these very things. Hence, he concludes, whatever certain people have in superabundance is due by natural law to the purpose of succoring the poor. For this reason, Ambrose, one of the church fathers, says, it is the hungry man's bread that you withhold, the naked man's cloak that you store away. The money that you bury in the earth is the price of the poor man's ransom and freedom. Now, this sort of view of, what is our property, what's it for? Aquinas doesn't really get into it here, but it's rooted, and other theologians get into this as well, is sort of a theology and understanding of creation. right? Adam and Eve being set over all the other creatures and the goods of the earth for the purpose of stewarding them, taking care of them, and not to be for themselves as individuals, Adam and Eve, but as the heads of the human race to all the humans that come after them. So this idea that the earth is for the good of, humanity, those made in God's image, is really at the root of this kind of understanding. Now, to answer the main question, Aquinas goes on, since, however, there are many who are in need, while it is impossible for all to be succored by means of the same thing, each one is entrusted with the stewardship of his own things, so that out of them he may come to the aid of those who are in need. Nevertheless, if the need be so manifest and urgent that it is evident that the present need must be remedied by whatever means are at hand, for instance, when a person is in some imminent danger and there is no other possible remedy, then it is lawful for a man to succor his own need by means of another's property, by taking it either openly or secretly. Nor is this, properly speaking, theft or robbery. He says that's actually not even really stealing. And why does he say this? Well, he goes on to say, it is not theft, properly speaking, to take secretly and use another's property in the case of extreme need. Now, he's qualifying this. You shouldn't just go and do this. But if you're starving, if it's a case of extreme need, then, what are those goods for? They're for the purpose of taking care of people. Because, he goes on, that which he takes for the support of his own life becomes his own property by reason of that need. And in the case of a like need, a man may also take secretly another man's property in order to succor his neighbor in need. Now, again, it's easy to be irresponsible with this and say, well, I can just take, he's very clearly qualifying it and say, no, if it's an extreme case of extreme need, then one is in this, if you're destitute, you may be in this kind of position. He's not recommending that you go out and start taking people's things, but he's trying to evaluate, what's the case like that? How are we to understand it ethically, morally? And his response is, in that case, the property sort of becomes yours in a sense. And why does he say that? Because he said that what belongs to human right, what's kind of established by human laws, who according to the laws of the city or the state of the nation, who does it belong to? He says that's really superseded by divine right, by natural right, and this is what God ordained these goods for, right? So I bring this up because, not that Ruth herself does not do this. She doesn't just go and do this secretly. She comes openly, and she gets alms, she gets the gleanings from Boaz's field. But I think it helps to jog our thinking a little bit about how this is a theologian who lived 800 years ago, and a very famous one. And as we'll see later on, it's consistent with what earlier things in the earlier church was said as well. But it opens us up, I think, to a different view of, well, what is ours? What belongs to us? Why does it belong? In what sense does it belong to us? Whose is it ultimately? And what's our responsibility to the things that we have? Okay. In theology, this principle that the goods of the earth, the material goods, are ultimately in God's design for the purpose of taking care of all people, is sometimes called by the term the universal destination of goods, which means, the goods that are in the earth that God provides for people are really ultimately meant to be for taking care of universal humanity, for everybody, okay? So this is just kind of an opening sort of thought experiment to get us to thinking about this question, and it leads me to reflect on this the act of almsgiving, like what Boaz does for Ruth, what anybody does when they're giving alms, when they're giving to the poor. I think there's this popular sort of sense that charity is charity, and whenever you're doing that, you're always sort of just going above and beyond. It's something supererogatory. It's something that it's not. It might be good for you to do, but you're being very gracious, right, in doing that, and that's not false. That's certainly true. But I think that can develop into a sort of a false dichotomy to say, well, if it's charity, then it's nothing of mine is really owed to anybody else in justice. And I think that's the idea that's challenged by this kind of understanding of our goods, right? It's not charity or justice. It can be charity and justice. Aquinas is saying the things that we have by natural law, by the laws sort of of morality that God has sort of implanted in human nature that anyone can theoretically understand, like, murder is wrong, stealing is wrong. We may need to be reminded of this, but the sense that they're really for other people, and there's a sense of owing to other people the things that we have. So with this kind of idea in mind, I now kind of want to circle back to Ruth 2, and just with this, there's a few parts of the text. Jack very helpfully introduced it to us. But as I read it, there are things that I hit upon that are echoing some of these questions that have arisen in this preliminary question. So we have Boaz, who's described as a prominent rich man. He's in this position of a person who is rich and who has abundance. Ruth came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Okay, so it is his field, right? But I think it's very interesting that as the text describes it, when Boaz comes out to the field, before he even turns to talk to Ruth or maybe even notice that she's there, what's the first thing that he does? He greets his servants, his fellow workers, and what does he say? The Lord be with you. Have you ever heard that phrase before? Yeah, we say that in church, right? In the Mass. That comes from Ruth 2:4. That's where we get it from, ultimately. And for us, that has a resonance of, this is what we do. When we come, we gather together in church. This place, the Lord's house, this place that belongs to the Lord, okay? And Jack has helpfully reminded us that Boaz is this type of the righteous man according to the law. What is Boaz doing? He is, and the way I understand it is he seems to have an awareness that as he goes out to the field, although it is his own field, what he's doing is really under the authority of the Lord, okay? He's referring everything that he does to the Lord, principally, okay? So it is his field, but in a sense, is it primarily his field? No, it's ultimately God's field, right? And the way that he acts, explicitly by invoking Yahweh and understanding that the work that he's going to do in his field is work for the Lord. I think that gives a sense of how he understands his own property as well. And as Jack also helpfully pointed out, these gleaning laws in Leviticus, they're part of the law, right? So doing the law, fulfilling the law, he's doing something, yes, charitable for Ruth, but as he's offering the gleanings to her and instructing his men to do the same, he's fulfilling what's required of him, right? So there's not this false dichotomy, right? So it can be a matter of charity and a matter of justice, right? So as we go through the text, we see all these ways in which he's doing that. He says, if you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink. He recognizes the need of Ruth. Ruth is described as being on her feet from early morning until now without resting even for a moment. So she's clearly weary. She's clearly poor. She's clearly in need. He says later, come and eat some of this bread. And she ate until she was satisfied. He's helping to address her need. He commands the young men who work for him, pull out some of your handfuls from her for the bundles and leave them for her to glean. Okay, so he's, in this position of authority. He's not just doing it as himself, like this is I may do this. No, he's commanding also the people who work for him to do this, as this is the right thing to do. He feels like in order to fulfill the law, in this instance, this is what he must do, right? And I think the referral of things back to the Lord again, we get in this verse 12. Ruth is Ruth asks, like, well, why have you had mercy on me in this way? And he says he's heard about what she did, how she came with Naomi, even though a foreigner, back to the land. And then he says to Ruth, may the Lord reward you for your deeds. May you have a full reward from the Lord and the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Now, of course, that's in the sense of she's aligned herself with Yahweh as her God. She's clung to Naomi. She's come back into the land where the Israelites are. But in another sense as well, she's come to the Lord for refuge insofar as she comes out to Boaz's field, right? Because it is his field, but it's his field that he has in stewardship to the Lord and the Lord's purposes for it, okay? And then we see even towards the end of the chapter, Ruth passes this on, right? So even though she herself is poor, she gleans all this and she has some left over. So what does she do? Does she hoard it? No, she does the same thing in return. She gives what was left over to her mother-in-law, Naomi, right? So this kind of mutual understanding of Boaz and Ruth, of kind of what is this all for. It doesn't have to hang on just being a merciful act. It's much deeper than that. So I think that hopefully we can begin to appreciate that, right? So with this in mind, in the time that we have left, and I do want to have some time to open up to get your perspectives as well, in order to sort of put a little more depth and confirmation into this understanding of, well, what is our duty to the poor? What is this historical Christian understanding of our goods and to whom they belong? To look at some passages from a couple of the church fathers, figures from the early church, who were bishops and in positions of authority, and preached homilies on these very issues to their congregations. And so I'm going to I have a lot of text on this handout. I'm just kind of would like to just read through it, and I comment here and there, but I think it's just helpful to sit with it and soak up kind of what they're saying. And then I'll have a few things to say at the end, but then we can also begin to dialogue. Okay. So first I want to look at what St. Basil of Caesarea says. He has some very interesting and provocative remarks in this sermon, I Will Tear Down My Barns. And now I should preface, what we're about to read, this is a challenging teaching, I think, for all of us, because it demands of us to think long and hard about how we use the things that we have, okay? So, I don't, put this forward from a position of saying, oh yeah, I've got this down. No, this is challenging for anybody, and I think especially from anyone who comes from a country like America that is very affluent, and we just have so much, especially relative to other parts of the world often. I think it's a challenge for all of us, okay? Just want to put that out there. So this sermon of St. Basil, he's commenting here on this parable from Luke 12. And it's pretty short, so I want to read it, but this will give some context to what he's reacting and responding to. So in Luke 12, there's the parable of the rich fool. Someone in the crowd asked Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God." So St. Basil is, they have read this in church, and he's then giving a homily on this text. So he says, quoting, "I will pull down my barns and build larger ones." Then Basil comments, "But if you fill these larger ones, what do you intend to do next? Will you tear them down yet again, only to build them up once more? What could be more ridiculous than this incessant toil, laboring to build, and then laboring to tear down again? If you want storehouses, you have them in the stomachs of the poor." Okay. Then he considers an objection, right? And this is a very familiar objection. We probably have been already thinking of it. "But whom do I treat unjustly, you say, by keeping what is my own? Tell me, what is your own? What did you bring into this life? From where did you receive it? It is as if someone were to take the first seat in the theater and then bar everyone else from attending, so that one person alone enjoys what is offered for the benefit of all in common. This is what the rich do. They seize common goods before others have the opportunity and then claim them as their own by right of preemption. For if we all took only what is necessary to satisfy our own needs, giving the rest to those who lack, no one would be rich, no one would be poor, and no one would be in need. Did you not come forth naked from the womb, and will you not return naked to the earth? Where then did you obtain your belongings? If you say that you acquired them by chance, then you deny God, since you neither recognize your Creator nor are you grateful to the one who gave these things to you. But if you acknowledge that they were given to you by God, then tell me, for what purpose did you receive them? Is God unjust when he distributes to us unequally the things that are necessary for this life? Why then are you wealthy while another is poor? Why else but so that you might receive the reward of benevolence and faithful stewardship, while the poor are honored for patient endurance in their struggles? He goes on. The things you receive in trust as a stewardship, have you not appropriated them for yourself? Is not the person who strips another of clothing called a thief? And those who do not clothe the naked when they have the power to do so, should they not be called the same? The bread you are holding back is for the hungry. The clothes you put away are for the naked. And the shoes that are rotting away, which with disuse, are for those who have none. The silver you keep buried in the earth is for the needy. Thus you are guilty of injustice toward as many as you might have aided and did not. How can I bring the sufferings of the poor to your attention, so that you might realize from what misery you are collecting riches for yourself? Oh, how desirable will those words appear to you on the day of judgment. And this is Matthew 25, as Jesus is describing the day of judgment. And what does Jesus say? Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Why? For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. But how great, Basil says, will be the trembling, the sweat, and the darkness that surrounds you when you hear the sentence. You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and for his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was naked, and you did not give me clothing. And this is, I think, a very interesting comment he makes on this. Moreover, those who are under accusation in this passage, are not those who have stolen anything. These charges are rather leveled against those who have not shared with others. And if you look at the text, that's precisely what Jesus is saying. I was hungry and you didn't give, right? It wasn't the commission of stealing, but this broader sense of stealing as someone being in need. And that is in Matthew 25, how Jesus describes, the position on the day of judgment. So Basil's sort of picking up on this, what the words of Christ, right? This is how we are to be judged. So it's, again, I think just expanding our understanding of, what is our responsibility in justice? What consists in being unjust? I think there's this element of justice, according to Basil and Aquinas in this historical Christian tradition, reflecting on the position of someone like Boaz, which Boaz acquits himself wonderfully and righteously in doing these things. But it can be challenging for us to think that this is not just a nice thing to do, but it's actually required of us. I want to turn now to another saint, St. John Chrysostom. He has a number of homilies on the story of Lazarus and the rich man, which we actually that was the reading for last week, so it's sort of timely. It's very recent for us. And St. John, in a number of ways, echoes what Basil says, but also gives us some helpful further things to consider. So he says, this is from his homily. See the man, he says, in his works. Indeed, this also is theft, not to share one's possessions. Perhaps this statement seems surprising to you, but do not be surprised. I shall bring you testimony for the divine scriptures, saying that not only the theft of others' goods, but also the failure to share one's own goods with others is theft and swindle and defraudation. What is this testimony? Accusing the Jews by the prophet, God says, the earth has brought forth her increase, and you have not brought forth your tithes, but the theft of the poor is in your houses. Since you have not given the accustomed offerings, he says, you have stolen the goods of the poor. He says this to show the rich that they hold the goods of the poor, even if they have inherited them from their fathers, or no matter how they have gathered their wealth. And elsewhere the scripture says, deprive not the poor of his living. To deprive is to take what belongs to another. For it is called deprivation when we take and keep what belongs to others. By this we are taught that when we do not show mercy, we will be punished just like those who steal. For our money is the Lord's, however we may have gathered it. If we provide for those in need, we shall obtain great plenty. This is why God has allowed you to have more, not for you to waste on drink, fancy food, expensive clothes, and all the other kinds of indolence, but for you to distribute to those in need. The rich man is a kind of steward of the money which is owed for the distribution to the poor. He is directed to distribute it to his fellow servants who are in want. So if he spends more on himself than his need requires, he will pay the harshest penalty hereafter. For his goods are not his own, but belong to his fellow servants. Now, he goes on here, because another thing that comes up is, when we're figuring out how to judge to give money to somebody, and are they really deserving of receiving from us? There's questions of their sort of moral character, their moral worth. Well, John Chrysostom has something to say about that as well. The poor man has one plea, his want and his standing in need. Do not require anything else from him, but even if he is the most wicked of all men, and is at a loss for his necessary sustenance, let us free him from hunger. Christ also commanded us to do this when he said, "Be like your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." The almsgiver is a harbor for those in necessity. A harbor receives all who have encountered shipwreck and frees them from danger. Whether they are bad or good, or whether they are in danger, it escorts them into its own shelter. So you likewise, when you see on earth the man who has encountered the shipwreck of poverty, do not judge him, do not seek an account of his life, but free him from his misfortune. Why do you make trouble for yourself? God has excused you from all officiousness and meddlesomeness. How much most of us would complain if God had bidden us first to examine each person's life exactly, to interfere with his behavior and his deeds, and only then to give alms. But as it is, we are freed from all this kind of annoyance. Then why do you bring excessive cares on yourselves? A judge is one thing, an almsgiver is another. Charity is so called because we give it even to the unworthy. He concludes, let us also do this, I beg you, without making any more inquiry than is necessary. Need alone is the poor man's worthiness. If anyone at all comes to us with this recommendation, let us not meddle any further. We do not provide for the manners, but for the man. We show mercy on him not because of his virtue, but because of his misfortune, in order that we ourselves may receive from the Master his great mercy, in order that we ourselves, unworthy as we are, may enjoy his philanthropy. For if we were going to investigate the worthiness of our fellow servants and inquire exactly, God will do the same for us. If we seek to require an accounting from our fellow servants, we ourselves will lose the philanthropy from above. For with the judgment you pronounced, you will be judged, he says. Okay. So, that's a lot of text, but I think it's helpful just to hear it preached. He's preaching this to his congregation, and I think these are all, we've been in familiar situations, right? And we've had many of these same thoughts. And I think it's a challenge to us. It helps us to consider, well, the responsibility that we have with what we possess should be taken very seriously, right? And that we do have responsibilities beyond just taking care of ourselves or the people just within our immediate ambit. Like, of course, we do have responsibilities in that sense, but this relation to the poor, as these early saints of Christianity are trying to bring out, is not optional, right? It's baked into the very understanding of the Christian message and the Christian life, okay? And so, Chrysostom bring, God, rain on the just and the unjust, and Basil talking about the day of judgment. They're bringing these back to the words of Christ, right? So it arises out of reflection on the Bible itself and what we're hearing from the message of Christ, okay? So my final thoughts, I just want to conclude. There's two more things I think even take this a step even further in theological depth. This is on the very last page of the handout. But an understanding of almsgiving as sacrifice and as a sort of foretaste or bringing incipiently into reality the new creation. Okay? This also comes from Chrysostom and Basil. They have a lot to say on the issues that we're talking about today. They're from different homilies, but I've included some text here because I think they're very, probing as well. So Chrysostom says in this other sermon, he talks about this concept of the altar of the poor. When you see a poor believer, think that you behold an altar. And what does he say about this? This altar is composed of the very members of Christ, and the body of the Lord is made your altar. He's playing on this idea that the members of Christ are Christ's body, right? So this, Christ's body is on the altar sort of at church, right? But there's another sense in which the church is the body of Christ. So he's kind of moving between these two senses. And he's saying the one is an altar. We have the Eucharist on that altar. But there's another sense in which there's a living altar of the body of Christ, the members of the body of Christ, the people around us. So he says this altar is composed of the very members of Christ, and the body of the Lord is made your altar. That then revere. On the flesh of the Lord you sacrifice the victim. This altar is more awful in the sense of arousing awe, right? Even than this which we now use, he's talking about in church. He's delivering this in church. The one that we now use, this altar is even more inspiring of awe, not only than that used of old. For this altar in church is admirable because the sacrifice that is laid upon it. But that, the merciful man's, not only on this account, but also because it is even composed of the very sacrifice which makes the other to be admired. So what is he saying? The altar that we have at church is just a material thing, stone or wood table or whatever, okay? The altar of the poor, you're looking at the living person as an altar, right? So they're composed of that very sacrifice, okay? Again, this is but a stone by nature. He's like, going like this, where he's standing probably, right? Or, pointing to the altar behind him. This is a stone by nature, but become holy because it receives the Lord's body. But that is holy because it is itself Christ's body. We are Christ's body, right? But you honor indeed this altar because it receives Christ's body. In church, we honor that altar because it receives the Eucharist. But him that is himself the body of Christ, the fellow believer, you treat with contumely, and when perishing, neglect. This altar you may see everywhere see lying, both in lanes and in marketplaces, and may sacrifice upon it every hour. For on this too is sacrifice performed. So he's extending this, when we come to church, we have sacrifice at the altar. This doesn't stop there. It's, this body of Christ, understanding and image in the various senses of it, links us to the living members as being altars upon which the sacrifice of having mercy on others can be performed. And he says, as a person of sort of eternal worth, that as an altar, that is more awesome, arousing our awe than, just the stone table that we have. As much as we revere the Eucharist itself as the body of Christ, the altar, he's saying, this is profound, right? For, to look at another person as an altar upon which you can lay your sacrifice, your giving to them. And then finally, I want to conclude, Basil. It's a short, but a very, I just love this way of thinking about it. He says, give but a little and you will gain much. Undo the primal sin by sharing your food. Just as Adam transmitted sin by eating wrongfully, so we wipe away the treacherous food when we remedy the need and hunger of our brothers and sisters. Okay, so he even sees almsgiving as undoing the sin of Adam in a way. Now, of course, this all has in the background, this is not independent from the work of Christ, actually making that a reality for us. But as Christians, as those who have been empowered by Christ, this conception of almsgiving as a continual outworking of salvation and of remaking the world, right? Undoing Adam's sin. When we do that, when we give food, instead of taking the illicit food, we give it away. We give what we have away. It's a foretaste, it's not going to be fulfilled until the last day, ultimately. But in a sense, it's beginning to bring that eschatological reality, the reality of the final state, into existence now on earth. So that is, and so my reflection arises from that out of the figure of Boaz, right? So what is he doing? Of course, he's having mercy on Ruth, but he's also obeying the gleaning laws. He's fulfilling the law. And as these Christian interpreters of our response to the poor would say, he's fulfilling an act that's due to them in justice because of their understanding of, well, what are our goods? What are they for? They're for the person in need.